So first of all, thank you so much for joining me. Dr. Madhavi Reddi received your PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in Media and Communication in 2022. You also have a master's in communication, culture and technology from Georgetown, and you've done your bachelor's in film and media. So you primarily focus on digital media, media studies, political communication, visual communication, along with an interest in Asian American media, culture studies, and critical culture theory. So just thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me today. But I wanted to briefly mention that once again, the purpose of this project and what we're doing with our conversation is just to inform listeners about how storytelling rooted in culture is present in the lives of South Asian women. I believe that by sharing these stories on how women have built careers and identity out for themselves while coming from a culture that tries to diminish them, we can build conversations on how these misogyny-laced stories that we learn from our childhood should be reframed and talked about more. Now, these stories form our opinions of ourselves, our bodies, sex, society, and they're passed down from one generation to the next. Now, of course, this isn't to say that everyone's experience and every experience is a negative one, or that the association with culture is purely negative. Statistically speaking, and from what I've grown up seeing, I thought that this would be a conversation worth having. So to ground this back to your work, it might be presumptuous to state this, but I think your research coincidentally merges with my project's core as well, and where your work focuses on themes of media and identity within the South Asian context. And obviously being an expert in critical cultural theory, I think I would have a lot to learn from you. And though I want most of this conversation to be on personal experience rather than academic, I have made some room to have those scholarly conversations at the end of our conversation. So my first question takes us into the topic a bit briefly. Because in the introduction I kind of define that I'm working on these interviews with successful South Asian women, or at least women who have had some success in their careers, what you see or understand success as from your experience and your perspective.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. I think that's a great question because it is different for every single person. Success to me is when you are able to do something that makes you happy, that aligns with what you believe your purpose is, when you're excited to wake up in the morning and get going. That's success to me. I really, really love what I study. I really get excited about thinking about storytelling, thinking about media, thinking about the patterns we see in South Asian American representation. It was a long journey to get here, but a meaningful one. When I was in high school, I used to I still do, like to watch Hindi films, Bollywood movies. I would watch a movie with my parents, every Friday night. And I thought that because I like watching films, that meant that I wanted to make films. So I went to American University and I did my undergraduate degree in film and media arts. And from there, I had a series of jobs after graduating that were, uh, involved in video, creating video, the technical aspect of filmmaking and video content creation. And there was a point the right before I went to Georgetown for my master's, I was working as a videographer. The title was Instructional Multimedia Technologist at Strayer University. So I was filming lectures. And while I was filming these lectures and watching these, sometimes there were professors, sometimes there were actors giving the lectures, I thought, oh, actually, you know what? I'm more interested in this academic element of talking about topics and researching topics, um, less so than being behind the camera. So that's what sparked my entry into graduate school. And while I was at Georgetown, um, learning about critical theory, learning about media studies, all these things, that's when I said, okay, yeah, this is definitely what I want to do. And so I graduated from Georgetown. I went on to do my PhD at UNC, and I really fell in love with the process of thinking and theorizing. And that's what brought me into this sphere. So to me, the fact that I get to do something that I'm excited about, which is research, that's success.
I think one thing that I see lacking in like South Asian in like experiences that South Asian women have that I've seen, that exposure element where they're allowed to go and see and experience new and different things rather than just what they're told and expected to do. I guess that also makes me wonder like did you feel like you had like any of those expectations or any expectations growing up, or did you have like that free reign to just go into things?
I think I definitely had free reign to go to explore what I wanted. From the time I was in preschool to the time I actually went to college, the thing that I wanted to do changed every couple years. When I was a preschooler, I wanted to be an illustrator. Then at one point, I wanted to be an um, I wanted to study snakes and bugs. And then at one point, I wanted to work, do like engineering, cars. At one point, for a long stretch, I wanted to be a psychologist. And then finally, film was where I ended up. So I've had parents who supported all of these decisions. The main concern was with film was, is this going to are you going to provide for yourself, because it was an unknown territory for my family. My parents are both scientists. They come from very academic backgrounds, so the idea of filmmaking was interesting to them, but also the real practicality of how will you support yourself was top of mind. They were very happy though that after I graduated, I was able to secure jobs, and then ultimately shifted into academia. I would say that while they were very supportive, there was a lot of curiosity from our community about what studying film entailed. And a lot of people would say, "Oh, your parents are letting you study film? Your parents are letting you major in film?" So that was really interesting. But for the most part, I've been very fortunate.
First, I kind of wanted to ask, like, what your perception or idea of that storytelling is.
So to me, storytelling is a means through which we make knowledge and information accessible or attractive or intriguing. It's really a way to capture audiences, especially when you're dealing with topics that are either uncomfortable. So a lot of my research is focused on race, but gender, class, or topics that are boring that you want to make interesting, right? Storytelling is this important mode of communication because it brings emotion into the dissemination of information, even when it's uncomfortable or if it's boring. So that's really what storytelling is to me.
Well, actually, first, like, when I say, like, those cultural stories that we grow up with, can you think of, like, an example of, like, what that was like for you? Like, was it positive? Was it negative? Like, these kind of, like, cultural ideas that inform how you see the world, how you see yourself, your body, relationships, family, motherhood, like, how did those look for you?
Yeah, I guess from that perspective, storytelling was often employed as an explanation for why we do certain things the way we do them. Growing up, there are these series of books. They're called Amar Chitra Kathas, which are like stories about with Hindu background, but also some historical context, like some stories about historical figures. And so, a lot of times, if there was a question around why we do a particular custom, that was addressed in one of these books. And a lot of people in my generation, a lot of my friends have grown up on these particular series, and they've been popular in the diaspora. I'm trying to think specifically of something that storytelling was used as a way to explain something to me, and I'm not able to at the moment.
I guess this is like a less formed thought or question. When I think of it, I think these stories informed a lot about disciplinement, right? So, like when you're on your period, never mention it. Or when you're in the house, always cover yourself and your body. Like any expression of femininity and sexuality should not be obvious, it should not be visible. And it became, at least in my observation, it became more of something that you just accept rather than question. And if you question, then you are bringing shame to your family for even considering that it could be wrong.
So then I think one really good example, right, is the ways in which hierarchy is structured in families,
Mhm.
the respect your elders discourse, and respect often means don't question. Respect often means sort of sacrificing yourself in service of elders. So many of these stories that I've read in the Amar Chitragatha, the books,
Yeah.
were about very obedient children who sacrificed some part of themselves in order to serve their parents or their elders. And these characters were valorized, and these stories were so popular because wow, look at how well behaved and how devoted this young person is to serving their parents, often at the expense of what they may want to do. We even see that translate into Bollywood films,
Mm.
where we see movies where a child, oftentimes a woman or a girl, has to make bigger sacrifices than a male counterpart, has higher expectations, and is then placed as the good person in opposition to a quote unquote modernized woman who dresses a certain way, who pursues certain career paths, who is outspoken. We see that percolate into Bollywood cinema, framing what behavior is acceptable, what a good woman is. Overall, a pattern that I've noticed across the board is the valorization of sacrifice. That even percolates into motherhood, right? The ways in which a good mother is framed. And what I've been finding really interesting is that sacrifice in motherhood is actually something that we see world over. All cultures kind of have elements of that. A good mother is one who puts the needs of others first and their needs second. And sometimes they don't even know what their needs are because because they're so focused on their family.
Over the last couple of days, actually, there's a lot of discourse on social media happening. There was this one particular clip from like some Pakistani drama, but it was this wife not refusing to, but just not wanting to wake up early to make breakfast for her husband. Like the music that they edited in the background was like as if someone died.
Yeah, yeah. It's all of those oral cues, visual cues that accompany moments of a woman standing up for herself, a moment of resistance, all contribute subconsciously to the ways in which audiences perceive the morality of such an act. And that's really important to think about when you're thinking about storytelling is not just telling a story. It's not the act of speaking. Storytelling is also what you see in the background. Storytelling is also the background music that you hear. Um, it's also the symbols that are placed and sprinkled throughout a narrative. So that's what storytelling makes storytelling so powerful, especially in South Asian cultures.
And I think like what's happening with like the current social media sphere is also there's so many like opinions and ideas coming in from like everyone. Like just the other day I came across a reel saying that the difference between sons and daughters is that I didn't come across this. A friend of mine, a male friend of mine, sent it to me. Oh, the difference between sons and daughters is that sons see their mother's sacrifice as the standard and daughters see it as trauma. And my genuine response was just,
I think I saw that too on
yeah.
Instagram, that exact thing, yeah.
Yeah. I was like, you pissed me off. First thing in the morning, and you've pissed me off because there's so much to unpack in that one
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely, absolutely, and that's the patriarchy, that's the fact that it is seen as sacrifice and seen as the standard and seen as something that, women should aspire to. My sons is very, very concerning. That said, there are a lot of people who are about to have sons now, or who have very small sons. I think there's a strong resistance movement to all of that, which is encouraging.
It kind of takes me to think like because like my interest is in South Asian culture and the way that these stereotypes are just ingrained in us, But specifically how I've seen these stereotypes create barriers for women, what they think that they can do in their career and with their aspirations. Similarly, with their careers, having or having not one. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with like the whole arranged marriage, how it's like on WhatsApp now, where you just have these like lists of she must have an engineering degree or she be a doctor, but she will not be allowed to work afterwards. Same way, like this translates to, like sexuality, where there's like an association with like how you must present yourself to be desirable. Emotional care only comes affiliated with like sexual presence in some
Yeah.
way. And, like, if you don't do that, then your husband is not required to, like, be there for you, and, like, all of those things like that. So I was wondering, in, like, observations like these, can you think of a moment that was personal to you, either in your life or someone you know, where you thought that or where you recognized that storytelling was making a difference, either good or bad?
Because tell me if you think that this is relevant, but this is something that I think about a lot about the workplace and just the perception of Asian women broadly. Because I am a scholar of Asian American media. When we think about stereotypes, especially about Asian women, if you look at the history of Asian American representation in American and Western film and media, there's this history of them being exoticized,
Mhm.
right? They are this exotic and mysterious. They're exotic and mysterious. This has had ripple effects in the workforce in subsequent decades because it shaped the extent to which women of Asian backgrounds were taken seriously. So I have seen plenty of, especially first generation women, Asian American women, South Asian American women, talk about how they struggled to be taken seriously in the workplace. And I really think that the way the media has portrayed them historically has a role to play because not only were they exoticized or made mysterious, they were also infantilized. You can see then how their ideas are shut down or they're ignored in a boardroom or in a meeting. You can see how they have to work twice there's that quote, they have to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Yeah.
um, and I think that I have noticed that in various capacities in my life where I've had to really maybe speak louder or I've had to do more background research on a topic to be heard. Um, and I really think that that is in part due to the way Asian American women have been portrayed in the media.
That actually, like, reminds me of a very specific memory from when I was younger, and I'm actually curious about your opinion on this. This one time in high school, there was a conversation happening at home. This was my first time taking sociology in high school as well. My high school teacher actually informed a lot of who I am right now. We kind of discussed how traditional serials, like drama serials, will have the same stereotype and representation of women in family and marriage and relationships. So you have the evil mother-in-law, you have the poor, helpless kind of daughter-in-law, you have the husband who sides with the mother who yells at his wife. Um, and in class, our discussions were these representations are harmful for people who are viewing them because they're normalizing all of this treatment for people watching at home, which again is grandmothers and like mother in law. But when I had this same conversation at home, my mother was actually under the opinion that no, it's realistic and it shows what actually happens in society, and it wouldn't make sense to show different or positive representations because that is just not realistic. My contribution to that was there is a connection between those two because if you keep representing harmful stuff, you're going to keep normalizing and generalizing it, and it's going to keep recycling. Whereas a positivity might start opening up our minds to different realities that can exist or different types of women in relationships that can exist.
Mm,
Because these negative perceptions can't possibly be all that there is to us in a way.
yeah.
And I guess like from a media and cultural studies perspective, like this was just me like as a high schooler being like something doesn't make sense. But from that perspective, from what you've seen and what you've studied, like how much of that kind of actually shows like those difference in representations.
This reminds me a lot of the discussions that were held around Indian matchmaking when the first season was released, because there was a lot of colorism and casteism being normalized in the ways in which participants and Seema Taparia, the matchmaker, talk about what a quote unquote good match is. So words like fair skinned, words like highly educated, vegetarian, various codes for caste and class, and then more overtly so color, like you're saying, normalized throughout the show. And there was a lot of backlash towards this for the exact reason you're saying. Should we be normalizing this? Should we just have this happen? There was an interesting conversation that I saw on YouTube. It was a Zoom call between Indian matchmaking's creator, Smriti Mundra, and the International Dalit Solidarity Network, where they were talking about, what are the impacts of normalizing caste discrimination, colorism, all of these things. And both sides of what you were just saying were represented, right? There is the side that we need to be critical and we need to call these things out because a lot of times the audience is not watching with a critical lens. They're watching with just being entertained. But then Smriti Mundra talked a lot about how, well, this is the reality that people go through. This is the reality of the situation. If we don't show it kind of in this raw way, then it's not realistic. So the whole debate with Indian matchmaking really reminded me of what you were saying. There are shows like Never Have I Ever, though,
Mhm.
which attempt to normalize or which attempt to kind of go against the grain, attempt to explore different possibilities of womanhood. Um, a lot of Mindy Kaling's work and
Yeah.
Never Have I Ever is has these messy female protagonists that are outwardly angry, like Davy is in Never Have I Ever, that deal with complex emotions, that are messy, right? And that is kind of going against the grain of what the original articulation in previous films and TV shows about South Asian women have shown. Also, in Never Have I Ever, her mom, for a period of time, dates a black man. And there is a lot to be said about the relationship between the South Asian community and the Black community, particularly when we think about racism that exists with South Asians. The fact that this was shown and normalized as a relationship that happens was revolutionary in many ways. Some of the critiques of that were that, well, you're not interrogating these tensions that exist between South Asian and Black groups, but there's always room to grow.
Like, there's just colorism across the board, right? Like, the fairer you are and the whiter you are, the better.
Yeah, so I think when we think about colorism within a South Asian context, we often can tie the roots of colorism to colonial rule,
Right.
but in an Indian context, we can also tie it to caste because there are trends that you see where people who are of upper castes are often, not always, but often lighter skinned. And that then is equated to eliteness or whatever it may be. With colonialism, I think that's more obvious as to how colorism emerged with colonialism. When we think about race and we think about color, but more so race, and how it's understood in Asian American contexts. There is a model called Kim's racial triangulation framework. Claire Jean Kim published this framework in the late 90s. And what it is it's got like it's like a graph, a y and x axis. As she draws this out on the y axis, at the top we've got she lists superior, and on the bottom, she lists inferior. On the x axis, on the left side, it's foreigner. On the right side, it's insider. And this is how she has triangulated the relationship between white Americans, Black Americans, and Asian Americans. And on the superior point on the y axis and the insider on the x axis, you have white Americans. And then she puts on the inferior and insider Black Americans. And in between, she's got on the foreigner end, but in between superior and inferior are Asian Americans. And if you've heard of the model minority stereotype or trope or myth, this is essentially speaking to that, right?
Right.
The idea that Asian Americans are kind of these quote unquote honorary white Americans. They're still foreigners because they have unassimilable differences like name, skin color, and things of that. But they're closer on the y-axis to the superior point, quote unquote superior point, which indicates white adjacency. Now, the idea or the myth of the model minority really is a way to create disconnect or to it's almost like a divide and conquer, sort of separating Black Americans, Asian Americans, all minority groups. It's a way to create divide between them, right? Because then when these minority groups are divided amongst themselves, it keeps white Americans in power. So that's kind of the inner working of that. However, the for the general public, I am finding a lot of times that the being considered model minority is being perceived as a good thing amongst Asian Americans. It is, yeah, Asian Americans, model minorities, like that's a good thing. And so they're not being critical of the fact that that white adjacency is what is making them feel like this is a good thing. It's internalized as, oh, we're the most successful, we have highest income, blah blah blah. But there's a lot of ignorance around the ways in which that title is creating division with Black Americans, with Latinx Americans, with other racial minority groups. And so that's really important. In my classes, I always talk about these things because these inner workings of race and how they are and how race is structured in America is really important. If we want to be critical, if we want to think about why certain stories are being told the way they are, really building that critical lens through media literacy, building media literacy through um, understanding the workings of power is really, really important and is something that I think not enough people do.
I think like picking like parts of what you said, just thinking about colorism and then the way that like it kind of recycles through storytelling as well in in like South Asian communities makes me think of how when little girls are like told how to like how they should look and what's acceptable to look, there's this there was in the past this obsession with like fairness creams, avoid the sun or don't go in the sun, which is just I don't even know how much truth there is to it, but it's just like these ideas that are in you from a young age just because of what's around you and what you're being told. And like aspects of that really speak to like this internalized racism as well, where even though like I am someone brown skin or like brown heritage or whatever, like the idea of, oh, I can't get tan because then what if I get darker? Like I see it in like my younger cousins, and not just because they're born with those ideas, but because of like how they're treated from people around them.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I've also heard it, I've heard this many times, which is it's so annoying, but so I'm Telugu, and a lot of times people will say, "Oh, you're very light skinned for a South Indian," which shows so much of ignorance on their part because there's so many factors that contribute to a person's skin color,
Yeah.
um, beyond I mean, first of all, there is, like, the caste component, um, there's the heritage component, there's a number of things, And then second, it implies a hierarchy, a pigmentocracy, right? Of
Right.
light being better and dark being less than. So, it's disappointing to see how people place so much of importance on that. This really reminds me of in 2014 when Nina Dowluri was, crowned Miss America, right? She was the first Indian American contestant to win this competition, and there were a lot of think pieces that published after she won that talked about how if this was India, she would not have won because of her darker complexion. And it sparked a lot of debate around around colorism and around how it's perceived in the diaspora versus in India. So I thought that that was interesting and very telling of the ways in which when we go back and look at Bollywood movies and we look at the trends in the tone of their skin, right? We see that they are all lighter skin and unrealistically so in many cases.
I was wondering that maybe like through all of this, for like your studies, through your experiences, did you at any point like come across ways or like were exposed to ways that combat these toxic cultural perceptions of just like self-image, women's connection to their bodies and how they see themselves or how they should?
I think that the more you equip yourself with knowledge and the more you internalize and understand the power structures that are keeping you small, the better you will be able to interrogate uh, self doubt, um, feelings of inadequacy, whatever it may be, right? So knowledge is power. And you had asked me a question earlier when you emailed me. You had asked me if there are any theoretical frameworks that would be useful for people who are interested in storytelling in South Asia. And I would say that any work that explores how identity is made sense of, that explores how meaning is made is a valuable uh, tool to have in your toolkit, right? So I'm thinking of Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding framework, which looks at how a producer encodes a message and encodes a media message. So a producer may intend to tell this particular story, but then it may be decoded by the audience in the way the producer intended, or it may not be. And knowing that when a person knows that, okay, this producer is probably trying to make me think this, but I have the agency and option not to view it in that way. I can put my own lens on it. Right. The crux of media literacy really is key in empowering oneself to move beyond any limiting beliefs that one may gather over their lifetime about themselves. Similarly, semiotics, right? The study of signs and symbols. What kinds of signs and symbols are being used to make us believe a message in a particular way? Can we call that out and then separate ourselves from that? That's another way in which we can equip ourselves to not internalize the discriminatory messaging of a lot of entertainment media.
Can you think of maybe like some text, like scholarly and or fiction that you would recommend people to read?
Yeah. Well, I will start with the academic because that's what I'm familiar with, or I interact with daily. Like I mentioned, Stuart Hall, the work of Stuart Hall, cultural studies, encoding, decoding, that's a really great place to start if someone is interested in finding a way to build a critical lens, to build on to grow as a media literate person. Roland Barthes' work on semiotics again. Sometimes we don't think about elements we see on TV as signs or symbols. I do an exercise when I teach Roland Barthes' work in my class. I do an exercise where I put a bunch of emojis on the projector and I have students talk about, okay, well, what does that mean to you? And so some of them are very obvious. Like if it's a smiley face, usually Like, that's a good thing, but there's at least half a dozen to a dozen different types of smiley faces. What do each of those symbolize? What do each of those mean? We talk about the thumbs up symbol and how sometimes that literally means okay or good, but sometimes it's a way of being passive aggressive when you would ordinarily use a very enthusiastic smiley face. When you use the thumbs up symbol, that means that you're kind of mad at that person, right? So, that's the way I teach it, but really it's a launch point into then watching films and seeing, okay, how is race being discussed in this film? What are some of the cultural codes that are not overt, but are actually playing on our psyche as we think about what it means to be Black in America, what it means to be South Asian in America, what it means to be white in America? What are some of these signs and symbols used? So that's another really good launch point for someone who wants to think about these things. I'm also happy to share my own work in political communication on the ways in which cultural codes are used to tell stories specifically about South Asian Americans or how South Asian American politicians use emotional appeals through storytelling to build communities. So, some of the frameworks that I discuss in my work are identity propaganda, or the ways in which people strategically use tropes to other racial minorities. I also have a framework called shared identity endorsement narratives, which look at the ways in which people with shared identity, so say Mindy Kaling endorsing Kamala Harris, and how she weaves in stories of South Asian heritage to build community around Kamala Harris, which in turn would help her political prospects. Those are some of the ways um, I think about identity and belonging and building, and storytelling. When it comes to works of fiction, I think any of these shows that are on Netflix,
Yeah.
like Never Have I Ever or Master of None, or on Prime, like, uh, we just finished watching Bait. Any of these shows
Okay.
are really, really great ways to explore what South Asian American content creators are thinking about, how they think about South Asian audiences, and what are some of the things that they're missing about the South Asian American experience, right? There's a lot to learn also from how stand-up comedians tell stories. I taught a course this past spring. It was a senior seminar here at Lehigh, where we talked about what I call second generation media, or media made by and about the second generation experience. So we watched these shows like Never Have I Ever, Master of None. We watched stand-up comedy by Hassan Minaj. We watched clips of Indian matchmaking. And something that a couple of students brought up was that these works oftentimes they reproduce the stereotypes that we were studying, like the model minority stereotype, or jokes about first generation parents who are often framed as thrifty or backward in thinking or overly strict or traditional. And we found it interesting that while a lot of these shows seek to break what we call in Asian American studies the bamboo ceiling, they also rely on stereotypes in order to gather attention and be successful. So, there is sort of this push to break stereotypes, but there's also this idea that we're existing in America that has social structures that we sometimes have to pander to in order to get noticed, right? So, yeah, there's so much to think about in both academic and fictional works.
Do you have a question for another scholar on like something that they could or should consider working on a little bit more, or something that you yourself are curious about and haven't like researched in yourself that you think can be expanded upon?
So, something that I'm starting to work on, I'm working on a manuscript right now for a book, an edited collection rather, is I am really fascinated by regional discrimination within South Asian, but particularly within the Indian context.
Mhm.
So I often will call this intra community othering in my work, right? How do people within the Indian subcontinent enact discrimination towards each other. And there is a good bit of literature about this along the lines of caste, along the lines of religion. But what fascinates me, because I've observed this so keenly in my own life, is the discrimination that happens between North Indian, South Indian, between states, between, like, say, Punjabis and Bengalis and Gujaratis and
Yeah.
Tamilians and Telugus and Maharashtrians. Why does that happen? How does that happen? How does that influence the way second generation Indian Americans see each other? You see a lot of that come up in the dating sphere. You see a lot of that coming up in social circles. So I'm starting to work on it, but if any academic is listening to this podcast, let me know if you want to collaborate on projects that study regional, state, ethno-linguistic identity and the discrimination that comes from it in the Indian American or Indian diasporic context. I'm ready to work on this because honestly it's a really salient way in which communities are built. It's complicated because it's not always implicated in power. It's just, oh, you speak this language, you speak this language, you're from this part of India, you're from this part of India. It's not necessarily implicated in power, but people use those identities to either befriend someone or to make fun of them or to avoid them, right? These divides are so strong. And I'm fascinated by how they transnationally manifest. These are all subconsciously internalized in different ways, and it's truly fascinating how it comes to be. And I think even when you think about going to an Indian restaurant, I asked my students this. I said, "What do you like to eat when you go to an Indian restaurant?" One student said, "Naan." One student said, uh, "Chicken tikka masala." Predominantly North Indian, predominantly Punjabi coded food is what everyone said, but that's what is understood as pan-Indian food. So in the same way, is there an articulation of Indian identity that is being framed as pan-Indian in the diaspora? I would argue kind of that Bollywood framed North Indian, like you said, fair-skinned, um, Hindu often, that identity is often what is put forth as the pan-Indian identity in the diaspora. So there's a real need for people to get into the granularity of what regional identity means and how, more importantly, how it's used as a point of discrimination or a point to create social circles with. So anyone listening who wants to work on this, let me know.